Hi, everyone. Let's talk about tuples and multiple assignment. So there are two basic types of sequences in Python. There are lists and there are tuples. Lists are mutable or changeable. You can actually change a part of a list without changing the whole thing. So one way you can change a list is you can just assign it to be a completely different list. But another way is you can refer to an index in the list and change that index, or you can splice that list and take away a little part of it and change that part of it. With a tuple, you can't change a small part of it. You have to change it as the whole thing. So you have to actually reassign it to be something totally different. The difference between how a tuple is denoted and a list is just tuples are enclosed in lists are enclosed in square brackets, and tuples are enclosed in parentheses. So here is a tuple. So here we're assigning the tuple xy to be the tuple 1, 5. This is an example of a multiple assignment. So what you can do is you can assign more than one variable its value at the same time. So you can assign multiple variables their values in one line to keep that line short, to keep your program short so it doesn't have too many lines. Or what's an actually advantageous thing is you can assign two values of a variable of variables to actually be switched. So if you assign x comma y to equal y comma x, what it does is it looks at what's the value of y. Okay, that's what's going to go in the left one. What's the value of x? That's going to go in the right one. And then those are going to be assigned to these respective variables. So the x is going to become what y was, and the y is going to become what x was. This is much easier as a way to switch values than what you'd have to do in old languages, which is like make a temporary variable. So you'd have to make a temporary variable, maybe assign that to be the value of x, then change x to be y, and then finally assign y to be what the temp variable was. All right. Another thing is that about the tuples, you don't actually have to write them in parentheses. This is how they would be displayed in Python, but you can actually write them with simply a comma separating. So you can go like this. And you can remove parentheses here as well. You can remove parentheses on either side also, and that would work just as well. So the tuple can have as many variables in it as you want. It can be as long as you want. It doesn't have to be two things separated by a comma. It could be three things separated by a comma, by commas. It could be as many as you want. It could be 5, 10, whatever you want. So here's an example where we're assigning x to be 1, y to be 2, and z to be 3. You can also use the sum function for a list or a tuple. So here's an example where I'm making a tuple out of x, y, and z. Here's an example where I'm making a list out of x, y, and z. And then when you print those out, you get 6 either way. 1 plus 2 plus 3 is 6. You just can't put x, y, and z separated by commas, because if you do this, then Python is treating those like separate arguments that are going in the sum function. The sum function actually doesn't take any more than 2 arguments. You can put in a list into it, and you could put in a starting value, but usually you just put in a list or a tuple into it. And so you can't put in more than 2 things into a sum. So you'd need to make those things into a list or a tuple before you do that. So a function can return a tuple, and sometimes that's useful when you have a function that computes more than one thing at a time. That might be where all those things might be useful in different places within the same program. So here's an example where we're computing the sum of just numbers 1 through n. So that's called plain sum. We're also computing the sum of the squares. So 1 squared plus 2 squared plus 3 squared plus 4 squared and so on, up to n squared. And that's going to be collected in square sum. And we're also computing the sum of cubes, 1 cubed plus 2 cubed plus 3 cubed and so on. So that's going to be in the cube sum. So notice what we're doing here is just saving a little bit of space using one line instead of 3 to initialize the plane sum, square sum, and cube sum to 0, all of them. And then a standard accumulator thing, just go through all the numbers from 1 through n and just add up their corresponding numbers to the plane sum, square sum, and cube sum. I squared here and I cubed here. I'm going to talk about this a little bit more, how you can do the same thing. But notice what I'm doing in the end is I'm returning a tuple, the plane sum, the square sum, and the cube sum. So when you return a tuple like that, then there are some interesting things that you can do in getting those values. One thing you can do is you can do a multiple assignment like this. So you can say sum 1, sum 2, sum 3. So you have 3 variables separated by commas that you're setting equal to that function. And so it's going to assign the first return value to sum 1, the second one to sum 2, and the third one to sum 3. So it's going to assign them exactly in the way that the function returns them. This makes it a lot easier to code sometimes if you have a function returning more than one thing. As you can see in the end, what's printed is that the sums are 10, 30, and 100. So if we add up 1 plus 2 plus 3 plus 4, oh, sorry, let me run this again. If you add up 1 plus 2 plus 3 plus 4 plus 5, you get 15. If you add up those squares, you get 55. And if you add up the if you add up the cubes, then you get 225. Okay. So before we move on to talking about other ways to capture all those 3 return values, I just want to say, if you wanted to write all this in one line, what you could do is you could use the same kind of multiple assignment. It's just that at some point it does become a little bit cumbersome. So you could write plane sum, comma, square sum, comma, cube sum equals plane sum plus I, that will add I to plane sum. Then comma, square sum plus I, and then cube sum plus I cubed. And this is one really long line. And so that tends to get a little bit out of hand and gets harder to read. So you make sure that you won't balance out the ease of reading with the saving of space. So you don't want to save space so much that it makes it really hard to read. Also, notice that I'm using the plus equals operators here. You can do that if you have only one assignment. You can't do that with multiple assignments. So you can't say plane sum, comma, square sum, comma, cube sum plus equals, and then put in a tuple here like that. That won't work. Try it. Okay. So another thing that you can do is, so we've got this sums function, right? So sums of n is going to return the plane sum, then square sum, then cube sum. So what you could do is, if you just wanted one of those, like if you wanted, let's say, the squares. So the squares is the second argument, or the second one of those things. What you can do is you can set squares, so a new variable, equal to sums of 5. So just call that function, and then subscript it. So index it just like you would a list. Okay, so that'll give you some of the squares there. So let me run that. So you get 55, just like you did back here. You can also collect all of these return values into one variable. We're going to call this all sums. So that's a tuple. So this variable is going to become a tuple. So again, it's kind of like a list, only you can't change a single item from it. You can only change the whole thing. So with this tuple, you can, again, do things like sum it or index one part of it. So like index the cubes. And so you can work with it after that. I just want to mention also an instance of multiple assignment where you can actually assign 3 variables equal to the 3 things, for example, in a list. So a list might have, a string, an integer, and a float, for example. So you can do that, and then you can, let's print out each one of those. So multiple assignment works for lists as well as tuples, and it just makes coding sometimes a lot easier. If you have, for example, like we did in class, if you're reading a CSV file and you have a few columns that are separated by commas, so you split that string up once you've read it. You've split it up into an array or a list, and you get a list like that. And then you can set the first thing, comma, second thing, comma, third thing equal to that list. And that splits up the list into the variables that you need. So if your first column was like a price, and the second column was like a name, and the third column was like, I don't know, some number, then you can set like price, comma, name, comma, number equal to that list, and then you can use those as you want. Let's go back to this. Okay. So just a couple more things here. To convert a list into a tuple, what you can do is, if you've got a list, you can just set another variable equal to tuple of nums. So tuple is an actual Python function that you can use anytime. So if we print out nums, that's a list. It's in square brackets. If we print out the num tuple, that's a tuple. It's in parentheses. You know something's a tuple if it prints it out as parentheses. Okay. And the last thing is, I'm going to show you how to unpack a tuple into a bunch of arguments. A tuple or a list, really. So like the print function, right? What it really does is it takes in arbitrarily many arguments. And in the next video, we'll actually see how you can create your own functions that take in arbitrarily many arguments. But for now, just notice what's happening here is that print is actually taking in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 arguments here. And what it's doing is it's separating them all with a space. Right? So if you have a tuple that you want to print out, well, if you just print out the tuple, it's going to print it with parentheses around it and commas separating the numbers. If you wanted it to print it out with just spaces separating it, then you could turn num tuple into a bunch of arguments for the print function by using the asterisk operator. So this is an unpacking operator that has actually a lot of uses. We're just going to talk about this one here. What it does is it turns a tuple into a lot of arguments for a function. So if you have a function that is taking in a lot of arguments, something other than print, maybe something that really requires you to enter a lot of things. Maybe you're entering a customer into a database and you need to enter their name, their order number, their I don't know, ticket, or their issue, or whatever it is that you need to enter. Maybe you need to enter a lot of things and you're calling a function with all these things. If you have a tuple storing these or a list storing these, you can put that list into the function by using this asterisk operator. You can also use the asterisk operator to unpack a list. So remember, nums was a list, so it works equally well for a list or a tuple. All right, thanks for listening. Play around with tuples. Just try all of the things that I've covered here. Just try and write a little piece of your own code just to see how it works. Thanks. Take care, everybody.